Are we expected to feel sorry for men? Is that what this is?
I think it would have been ridiculous until really very recently for any man to make arguments like this. It's certainly ridiculous for anybody of even my generation. But I think with some justification, young men, particularly of 20, do go through life and they don't recognise the world that, for example, feminist campaigners describe. They do experience discrimination in education. They do feel as though schools can be architected against them sometimes. They get whacked on Ritalin for being too boisterous. When they get into the workplace and go and apply for jobs and all the rest of it, they don't have all the same sort of programmes and foundations and extra schemes and all the rest of it. Yes, it would be ridiculous to have made this argument even perhaps half a decade ago, but I don't think it is anymore.
Right, but your main claim is about the gender pay gap, that actually that is a myth. And it's not a myth, is it?
Yes,
even
it is
today,
a myth, yes.
Well, it's not a myth according to the figures from the ONS, the Office for National Statistics, because even in November last year, they showed that the gender pay gap for all employees, full-time and part-time, still benefits men by 19.1%. That's their figures.
Yes. Well,
for full-time employment, just one, it was 9.4% less, and that's in April this year. Now, there is a narrow figure that they use too, which shows that hourly earnings in April 2014, with women working for more than 30 hours a week, were actually paid 1.1% more. But that's it. It's just that bracket. And actually, when you get men and women workers in their 40s, 50s or 60s, again, the gender pay gap is in favour of men. So it's a myth.
Well, you're right about all of that stuff, but you're wrong about why it's happening.
Well, hang on a second, though, because you made the claim in your piece, in your film, that women are not paid, or rather men are not paid more than women, and they are.
Well, you have to understand where the figures come from, right? These figures...
you must understand.
These figures are... You're going to accuse me of mansplaining, aren't you?
No,
these figures come from averages across society. They don't take into account the different life choices that women make. The reality is that women do prefer a more balanced life. When they go to work, even if they don't have babies, they take longer holidays. They tend to take more holidays. And the reason that they are paid more, up to about 30, 35, 39, depending on whose figures you believe. The reason that flips
no, only
at the
between
end,
30 and 39.
No, that's actually not true. The reason that the figures flip after that age is because women make different life choices.
Right.
And if you take those life choices into account, no serious economist believes this stuff. It's repeated by politicians right up to President Obama, but no serious economist takes the wage gap seriously.
Caroline.
Well, I think some of those life choices aren't just a woman's life choice, it's a family life choice, and part of that is determined by who's the higher income earner. So when you get to the point, I mean, look, I had my kids in my 20s, but more people are having them in their 30s and later. You make a decision as a family about who's got the earning power. Now, in a lot of families, the male partner in those relationships, if it's a male-female relationship, is often earning more. So the life choice they're making is based on who's bringing more in. But this goes back to the fact that I believe that we still have a huge amount of job segregation when it comes to gender.
So hang on. You're making an assumption.
Can I finish my point?
You're making an assumption that this
is
based on some sort of...
No, I hadn't finished what I was going to say. I think a lot of jobs that are high-income jobs, engineers, for example, we have hardly any women and girls in that area, and we need to have that in there. Often in school, the choices that are put in front of girls are for the less-paid jobs and professions. If you look at the number of women... Hang on. If you look at the number of women who work in health and social care compared to men, it is much higher, and there's often a low value and a pay value.
Should we be advertising those to men?
So what I think is the way to address this,
some professions are over.
I think the way to address this is about tackling the way in which boys and girls are encouraged to go in certain jobs. I would actually say that actually one of our problems in our schools is what we're seeing is actually working class kids less likely to end up in the higher paying professions. That worries me an awful lot, and that's where I do think working class boys are often losing out. But there is also
not really a class issue.
It's the payover.
You're making an assumption.
It's part of the class issue that you don't get into the jobs that pay the highest paid wages.
Well, let Milo come out. So, I mean, Milo, one of the things you do mention, which is talked about a lot, is that girls are outperforming boys at school.
Right.
More of them are going to university. Employers prefer them. This is anecdotal.
Yes.
I have to say.
No,
they're
it's
more
not
driven.
anecdotal.
Well,
actually, there are studies now.
Even if
3 weeks ago, a study came out that showed that men and women going for the same job with the same qualification in STEM fields,
the
women are 3 to 1 more likely to get the job because it's a generational thing. You know, it's happening very, very recently. In the last 5 years, a lot of stuff has happened very, very fast.
Right, George, what do you think? Do you think at the moment that there is beginning to be a turnaround, that actually, despite the pay issue, which we can agree to disagree on, that actually men are still paid more than women for the same or very similar jobs in a lot of cases?
It's just not
according
true.
To the statistics.
Well, it's a feminist myth that will not die.
But are men now feeling the
true.
pressure of the success of women?
No, I think, though, where you make an interesting point is that there is an improvement, there's a convergence. I think if you look at younger people, you're probably right, that actually there's a difference between people in their 20s and 30s and those who are a bit older. But I think part of that's not to say there's not a problem. There's still a big problem. We've still only got around 20% of FTSE 100 companies that have got women.
Again, this is based on faulty assumptions. I'm sorry to
No.
interrupt.
Well, let me just finish.
Assumptions.
It's not a faulty, because actually I think what we need to do better at is enabling women to resume a career after they've had a family and continue to climb up. Yes, I know, but because one of the things I think, it's all very well to say, of course, they take a break out of their career to raise a family, but as a country we've got to get much better at enabling them to resume a career and carry on.
Whether women have a family or not.
I've got the editor screaming, we must end it now. Sorry, we've run out of time, thank you.
Thanks.
I'd come back on and talk about Greek debt next time. It's safer territory.
Yes, with writer and broadcaster Milo Yiannopoulos and journalist and author Nikki Hodgson. Ladies first. Nikki, what do you think?
I think it's a great idea. It's brilliant that David Cameron's embraced this initiative, which I actually think came from Labour originally. It doesn't need to be a finger-pointing exercise. I think that's the main point to make. This is just a really good chance to look at how boosting women's earning power can boost the economy.
You disagree, Milo?
Well, actually, I think it's a great idea, but not for the same reasons. The problem is that what most people don't realise, the gender pay gap is a sort of myth. No economist takes it seriously. The ONS figures come from broad church sort of averages across the workforce, and when you take into account the different choices women make, whether or not you include children in that, actually the pay gap narrows to zero. So I'm in favour of this only because it's going to really embarrass these campaigners who constantly tell women that they're victims and that they're suffering under this sort of patriarchal society. Actually, women and men get paid pretty much the same, to the point of a couple of percent. So I am in favour of it, but only because it's going to explode one of the most persistent feminist myths of our time, the gender pay gap.
Nikki, it amounts to zero, this pay gap.
No, I don't think that's true at all. I think the issue is that women tend to take, lower paid work, more part-time work. In these kinds of companies, that's not the case. But what it is going to show is how women are not very good at pushing themselves forward sometimes in the corporate environment. And they really struggle to ask for what they're worth. And that is a problem for all of us, because ultimately that, affects the economy, it affects the earning potential of these companies.
Milo, the latest percentages suggest that the gender pay gap currently stands at 19.1%, which means a woman on average earns 80p for every pound a man earns.
Well, the Office for National Statistics figures are based on 1% of an average right the way across the industry, so they don't take into account the different kinds of jobs people are doing, so really they're effectively meaningless. But there's a very simple question that demonstrates why the whole debate is nonsense and why the pay gap is a ridiculous sort of fabrication. And it's this: if women are doing the same work for less money, why aren't companies full of women? Why aren't employers going out actively seeking women? Well, they don't, and they don't for some of the same reasons that women take different sorts of roles and different part-time roles. Women don't work as long hours as men do, even if they don't have children. They take longer holidays. They don't make as much money for their firms. They don't work the same overtime. So we can't really expect them to be compensated the same as men when they don't work as hard. Now, that's not, I don't mean that to sound, unkind about women. Women simply have different priorities in life. Most women want a more balanced life. They want time with their family. They want to do hobbies. They want more time away on holiday. They don't want to put in the work that those sort of obsessive, aggressive, sort of goal-oriented male professions sometimes demand. The law, for example. Women just aren't really interested in devoting their whole life to work in that way. And the very broad brush figures from the ONS simply reflect that. What they don't show is that a woman going to the workplace is going to be paid less than a man for the same. In fact, under the age of 35 in the UK and the US, women are paid more in the same sorts of roles, and they're 2 to 1 more likely to get jobs in science and maths because employers are so desperate to hire women.
Nikki's not generalising at all there about how hard women work.
No, exactly. I think there's hundreds of women that won't be watching this programme because they're too busy working in order to argue with that point. I don't think that's true at all. What we really have is a social problem, a problem where we expect women to take the burden of family care, to care for elder relatives, and so as a result they often end up working less hard, as Milo puts it, because what they're doing is they're working second shifts, third shifts, caring for other people. What we need is a culture change to allow women to be able to work just as hard as men if they so choose. And that isn't happening yet. But what would be good, about publishing these results is that it would pave the way for a conversation about how society is structured so that women aren't able to function as highly as men are in some professions.
Oh, you were too gentle with him. Milo, are you suggesting for 1 second that I do not work as hard as my male colleagues? I take more time off than my male colleagues.
Well, I think,
and I am not in any way as committed as my male colleagues.
I think, and I mean this in the nicest and most complimentary way possible, you're probably atypical in most respects as a sort of workaholic of either gender. You're probably not typical of women. You're probably not typical of anyone in the kind of work that you do. What I'm talking about is not, bashing women for not putting in the hours. What I'm saying is, in general, women look for different things from life. So they look to fulfill themselves to flourish in slightly different ways. Of course, if you look at the end statistics about pay, they're going to reflect that. That's not necessarily a problem. Now, when people lose the economic argument, they always switch to the social argument, as your other guest just did. And unfortunately, the problem is that a lot of this is underpinned by this sort of constant victimhood complex that women are encouraged to buy into. They're given this victimhood script about, whether it's rape culture on campus or pay under the male average. And most of it's based on ridiculous sort of social science studies that don't stand up to the most basic scrutiny. Most of it simply isn't true. And I think the majority of women don't want to be patronised, don't want to be given special privileges, don't want to be given special dispensation. They want to go out to the workplace, be paid what they're worth. And, of course, if they want to raise a family, they're not going to get to be CEO or not going to get to, to be a partner in a law firm. You can't have it all. You can't do all of these things. And what really sort of frustrates me, and I think frustrates a lot of ordinary women who, find these sorts of debates a bit dull and a bit mystifying, is that there's some sort of somehow implication always behind the scenes that being, that motherhood is a bad thing, and that it's a bad thing for a woman to aspire to raise a family and to be a mother. Actually, it's sort of one of the most extraordinary things that anybody can accomplish and anybody can do. But there's this sort of assumption that, if you do that, then we've got to make sort of special dispensation when you go back to work and pay you more and give you all these benefits and whatever, rather than celebrating the unique things that women can do in society that men can't.
You started off that answer, Nikki, by trying to compliment me and take the wind out of my sails. You have a go.
Absolutely. I've got no time for that argument whatsoever. Women want to do many varied and amazing things for their lives. Motherhood might be part of that. But, again, if that's such a wonderful thing to do, why are men not bending over backwards to take time off to raise their children? They're not, because the culture is not set up to encourage men to share the load of care. Women, even when they're married and working, do more domestic chores than men do. We've seen these surveys time and time again, and I think it's really insulting to say that women, might not be as inclined to work as hard or want different things from life. There are plenty of women who are hugely ambitious. Just look at the number of graduates that we have now. Women are outstripping men. They're getting better degrees. What we haven't seen yet is culture change to accommodate and to reflect that. And I think the other thing is that it tends to be older women often that are also in part-time work positions, but we shouldn't just leave them to flounder. They're often picking up care bills for elderly parents as well as looking after children and the rest of their families. So, I just think Milo's argument is ridiculous that women, shouldn't be paid as much because they want other things from life.
OK, Milo, we've been given more time, so you're going to have to work even harder. It's more than 40 years since the Equal Pay Act, and yet still it is a fact that women do not earn as much as men.
No, I'm sorry, it's not a fact. You can only say that if you take broad brush averages across all industries and all genders, and you can say the amount of money going to women is a bit less.
Well,
it's not. I mean, for one thing, it's illegal to pay a woman less than a man for the same work.
Interrupt him, Nikki. Go on.
No, they say,
it's illegal to pay a woman.
If that's the case, then when these results are published, they won't reveal anything. They won't reveal any difference, but they're going to. That's the point. The whole reason David Cameron is encouraging it.
I want them to be published because what they're going to show is that at all stages, all else being equal, the genders are paid the same. Or even what they might show, you're saying the culture hasn't changed. I think your argument's 20 years out of date. The culture has changed, which is precisely why there are more women going to university, more women graduate from university, they're getting higher grades. They're 2-to-1 favoured when they go for job applications, particularly in science and technology, and they're paid more, depending on whose figures you believe, up to the age of 30, 35 or 39. It's probably about 35. Women are paid more than men.
But
so whatever gender pay gap you're talking about has already been fixed.
But it hasn't.
So the good news for you is that there isn't a problem anymore, although there used to be, and that if we do release these figures, which I'm very excited about, they're going to prove me right. So I guess we'll have to wait and see.
But that's not true. I mean, the point is the gap is there still, and older women in particular suffer more from it from younger women. We shouldn't just leave older women, you know, to flounder, should we? Just because they were part of a generation where it was even more difficult for them to get on.
I'm making a specific explanation about where these figures come from, and you haven't really addressed the point that I'm making. What I'm saying is that you can only create this gender gap when you take a broad brush across all genders, all sectors, all work. That doesn't reflect the different choices people make, and employers aren't, you know, shouldn't be forced to pay a full-time salary to somebody who works part-time. You haven't come up with a solution to that, and you haven't addressed the problem with the figures, which is that no serious economist treats the gender pay gap as a problem to be solved. No economist thinks this is a problem because they realise what I'm explaining.
Is that male economists or female economists, just to be clear?
Well, I mean, where I get most of my figures on this from is from a feminist female academic, Christina Hoff Sommers at the American Enterprise Institute in the US, who looks at the figures from the UK and the US, and she does a broad survey of all economists, I'm sure of all genders, but my source for this sort of stuff is generally Christina Hoff Sommers. So she is a female feminist academic who is mystified that this is this sort of feminist myth that won't die.
Good for her. Nikki, final thought to you.
I just think that we need to see the figures published, because then we can start analysing the data. You know, publishing the numbers without any analysis.